To the why, first of all, and thank you to all of you for being here today. When Carla asked me to present on this topic, which I've been teaching and presenting on for a while, more than a decade, my first thought was, of course, that...
You need to use a microphone.
Sorry, I don't usually require one, but I understand you're taping. Okay. My first thought was this should probably be an African American person who has experienced the detrimental effects of this. But I understand in our climate today of talking about race, it really is a white problem. And the difficulty I know that African Americans have in talking about this is people dismiss it as you're just playing the race card, and the whole argument is dismissed. So my experience has been as an ally that it is often important to be the one to speak up and say this is a problem, and you get taken more seriously. That's not right, but it is the way it is. And so I accepted the kind invitation to do this today. So I'll try to take you through some things that I'm sure a lot of you know, but I think are worth saying, as well as present some data, up-to-date data on the generational wealth gap. Now, we're going to talk about the black-white gap. And I understand that there are people of color who have a variety of different experiences, and we should honor all of those. But in the time I have today, and because of the unique experience of African Americans in our society, it's very important, I think, to talk about the black-white gap for a variety of reasons that will come up in my presentation too. In 1903, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote in Souls of Black Folk that the problem of the 20th century was the problem of the color line. We're over 100 years later, and it's still the problem, I think, as we look at generational wealth, as we look at issues of policing, as we look everywhere in our society, politics, every institution, race is still a problem. In 1944, the Carnegie Commission commissioned a report on race in America, came out as an American dilemma, drew on Gunnar Myrdal, Nobel Prize-winning economist from Sweden, because they thought they needed a white guy to head it. But most of the work was done by Dr. Ralph Bunche, the first African American to win a Nobel Peace Prize, the founder of the United Nations. And in that report, 2 volumes, thousands of pages, they said, the race problem in America is a white man's problem. That's back in 1944, and I think it still is. So that's why I'm here today. So what we're going to do is try to briefly answer these 3 questions. What is the generational wealth gap? How was it created? It didn't just happen. It's not an accident. It was actively and systemically and systematically created. And, of course, what can we do about it? So, what is it? In racial terms, it is an inequality between white families and black families that is fundamental. So we're talking about not an inconsequential difference, an accidental difference, a small difference that varies, but a large difference that matters. It's structural in that it's not a matter of bad actors. Of course, there are bad actors out there. We know that. But this isn't caused by simply individual bad actors. It's structural, it's built into the system, and I'll try to show you that, and persistent across generations. So it's really an intergenerational wealth gap. So we'll talk about it. So here's some of the most up-to-date data. This is family wealth. It's by median. Now, just as a quick math review, and I know math textbooks are very controversial these days, but the median is the middle figure. In any distribution that's highly unequal or skewed, as say in mathematics, and of course the wealth distribution is highly skewed toward the top end, right? There's a few really wealthy people and a lot of us down here where we are, right? So the average or mean is going to be highly distorted. I mean, the average wealth of Elon Musk and me is pretty darn high. It's over $100 billion. But I guarantee you he's got most of it. So that's a completely deceptive figure, right? So the mean is going to be artificially high. The median is the figure exactly in the middle, half or more, half or less. Just as a quick illustration, if you took heights, if you have an extremely tall person, the median is still going to be the person in the middle, and that's going to be representative. But if you take the average height of that group, every single person in that group but one is going to be under the average, right? It's ridiculous. So anything that has to do with wealth and income, be very suspicious when you're shown averages. So, median, you see that white wealth, the middle family of whites, half of all whites have own more, and this is net worth, assets minus liabilities, of $188,000. African American families, $24,000. That's the middle figure. That is a 13 times gap between wealth. So just looking at it today, in terms of your ownership of property, right? This is your ability to get loans from banks. This is your ability to leverage starting a business. This is your ability to send your kids to college. All of that. Interesting enough, I'll just show you the mean. Obviously, the figures are way higher because they're distorted by those high groups, but still, we have a 14.5 times gap between the average wealth. And keep in mind, this average wealth down here includes Beyonce and Jay-Z and LeBron James and Oprah, and it's still there. $24,000. I don't think anybody in this room would buy a house for $24,000, would ever want a house for $24,000. And yet that's the average wealth of African American families. This is families, not individuals, because most of us live in families, and it's family wealth that's useful. So, does wealth grow over as you age? Yes, typically. But look at white children start, by the time they're 35, have average wealth of $25,000. $600 is the median wealth for black families 35 and under. What a difference. That is a 42 times gap. So white kids, the median of white kids starting out, 42 times what blacks have. Imagine running a track race where the white folks are 42 times the distance around the track already. What kind of race is that? As we go into prime earning years, we've got a gap of over 4.5 times. And over 55, the peak of earning and preparing for retirement, $315,000 median wealth for white families, $53,000 for African American families, and a gap of almost 6 times. So, looking at intergenerational wealth gap, obviously the white distribution is higher than the African American distribution. We just saw that. One way we can look at things is to rank wealth and divide it into equal groups. You can divide it in half, thirds, 20ths, whatever you want. It's usually done in fifths, so that's what each color is. 20%. You've got the top 20%, the bottom 20%. White distribution being higher than the black distribution. So let's look at, for people whose parents are in the middle 20% of that wealth distribution. So let's just talk about what might be middle class at the moment, right? What are the odds that they wind up the rags to riches, not exactly rags, middle class to riches, 16% for children raised in middle 20%, only 5% for African Americans. And if you look at from here up, the figure is white kids born into middle class wealth families have a 62% chance of staying the same or moving up. African Americans, 34%. And look, actually African Americans have a greater chance of being poor than they have of being middle class or up in terms of the wealth distribution. That's intergenerational wealth. Well, let's look at a better scenario. What about sort of upper middle class, the second 20%? Parents, you're born into here. What happens? Whites have a 25% chance. African Americans, 5% chance. Put those together. There's greater than half, 50% chance that kids born in an upper middle class white family will stay the same or move up. African Americans, only 15%. And look at this. Still a 39% chance of winding up in the bottom. If you look at the top, 43% white families stay there, white kids stay where their family put them, only 24% of African Americans. So something's clearly going on here, right? This is structural. This is kind of a complicated chart, but kind of important. The circles indicate the percent of parents' education, with the orange circles being white and the blue being African American. So, for instance, 20 said this is best case scenario, 2-parent families. So we're looking at 2-parent families here, both white and black. 27% of all 2-parent white families have at least one with less than high school education. 41%, it may be hard to see because it overlaps with Hispanic, 41% of African American 2-parent families. But even with the same level of education, notice if both parents have bachelor's degrees, because here is where they fall on the wealth distribution. So white kids born in families and raised in families with 2 parents with bachelor's degrees are at the 65th percentile of wealth. African Americans, again, 2 parents, college degrees, are at the 40th percentile, lower than even the kids raised in families with 1 parent that didn't go to even graduate from high school for whites. Not a single bit of education raises, on the average, black families above white families. Here's the median, another way to look at median wealth by race and ethnicity education. And you see that education, again the orange is white and the blue is African American. You see that education, more education increases your wealth. There's a much bigger impact for white families than there is for black. And you notice that the impact for blacks with postgraduate degrees is lower or about the same as whites with high school education only. Clearly something is going on in this system, right? Important kind of wealth. This table, these are percentiles, okay, from the lowest percentile to the highest 10th. These are ratios, you don't need to worry too much about the y-axis. The poorest people aren't shown here because the red is debt, and there's so much debt at this end that it's not even, they didn't even bother to graph it. So they don't even start till the 15th percentile. Well, the gray is liquid assets, that's cash, right? Either bank account or just cash. Purple is ownership of things like cars. And for most of us, that's the second biggest investment we have. The bigger investment is housing, and that's in the green. And the purple is stocks, bonds, and other kinds of financial assets. So you see that until you get to the 35th percentile, at the 35th percentile, this is, by the way, housing equity. This isn't how much you bought your house for. This is how much equity you actually have in it. And debt. At the 35th percentile, this is for everybody, black and white, and Hispanic, and everyone. But at the 35th percentile, it's about even. Housing, net worth, and debt. It's only beyond that housing begins to become an asset all the way up. And then increasingly for the wealthy, stocks and bonds. So housing is clearly a key asset. We know that. But the data shows that. And you see, in terms of housing, the median value of assets for whites significantly higher than for African Americans. So, how is it created? Well, this is a long story that I'll try to make short. But being a sociologist, of course, we recognize complications. In American society, we have a bias toward the individual. You know, we celebrate the individual right. We celebrate individual rights. It's written into our Constitution. I'm happy to live in a society that celebrates individual rights. But we tend to think in terms of individuals. That's why psychology is a lot more popular than sociology. But you're getting a sociologist today, so I'm going to complicate it by saying, yes, we need to look at individual actions, but we also need to look at institutional phenomena. Institutions are standardized patterns of behaviors and policies. I'll talk more about them in a moment. And we need to look at the society. Now, Hardiman and Jackson come up with this 12-cube model, which I like, because it includes both behavior and attitudes, and unconscious as well as conscious across the board. However, because of the individualistic fallacy, we think they're all equal, but they're not. I would argue that it really looks like this. Yes, individual actions matter, conscious and unconscious behavior, attitudes, but really it's institutional practices and societal ideologies. So these institutional practices, when you standardize things and routinize things, they become built in to the process. And they become, we borrowed a term from geology, sedimented. Just like rock layers. You know, the sediments are laid down over time and then compressed, and they become hard. And also underground. So to find institutional patterns, you often have to dig, and that digging is not easy, just like it isn't for geologists. Or you have to go into caves. It's only when there's cataclysmic events that lift up those rocks that we can see those patterns. So we have a George Floyd. And suddenly, people discover, oh my gosh, there are standardized practices by police departments that are negatively impacted. But it takes cataclysmic events to see those patterns or serious investigation. And that's part of what we're doing here today, and thank you for being here for that. There's also dominant cultural beliefs. I want to emphasize, though, that racism is a system. Anything with an ism is a system. You already know this. Capitalism, socialism, communism, feudalism. These are all systems. Racism is a system too. We've got this notion that it's just people with, bigots. People with bad attitude. That's a racist thing to say. You're a racist, whatever. I can't excuse bigotry. Anybody can be bigoted. Anybody can have blind spots and prejudice. But racism is a system that is rigged in favor of white people. Whether I want it that way or not, whether you want it that way or not, it is rigged already. It's a system. And I would argue it's the default system in the United States of America. But racism is baked in. And I'll have to go through this pretty quickly because we've got a long history to talk about. Talk about the history of African Americans in this country from the beginning until now. What we've got is forms of systemic discrimination that I'll just try to talk about briefly. Now, we've talked about slavery, although it's becoming extremely controversial to put it in textbooks and teach it to kids now, which is very problematic in my view, because we just gloss over it like, well, that thing happened and we got over it and it's all good now, without really examining the extreme brutality of slavery. Now, every black person in America was not a slave. There were free blacks that immigrated here. There were people who won their freedom. But the existence of slavery as an institution impacted every single black person in this country. Where were they going to get slaves? They bred them. In the decades before the Civil War, the prime export of North Carolina and South Carolina was not rice, was not tobacco, was people. They were breeding slaves and sending them west as their major crop. That's real. Of course, the brutality of it is the famous picture of Gordon, a slave who escaped to Northern troops during the Civil War. There just happened to be amateur photographers there who took his picture when they were fitting him for a uniform. And the publication of this picture turned a lot of people into abolitionists in the North. But we know this is not unusual. Terrible living conditions, systematic rape of black women, black codes that prohibited travel, literacy, meeting in groups, the Fugitive Slave Act, which created rewards for white people to re-enslave black people, or just to enslave black people. And you may have seen 12 Years a Slave. If not, I highly recommend it, because it's a true story of Solomon Northrop, a free black man in the North who was captured by fugitive slave traders and enslaved for 12 years in the South. A free black man whose freedom didn't matter. Dred Scott. Dred Scott was a slave in Louisiana. His master moved to Minnesota, a free state that outlawed slavery. They lived there for a while, moved to Missouri, a slave state. But Dred Scott filed a lawsuit and said, I was in Minnesota. I'm not a slave anymore. Anyway, Birth of a Nation, which, again, I highly recommend if you haven't seen. True story of the Nat Turner slave revolt. But also, even though they revolted, you see what the consequences were, because they were pretty sure they wanted to keep slavery. And just in case you wondered, I found it very interesting to look at Confederate money, or money from southern states. They put their slaves on the money. So don't tell me it wasn't about slavery. They were saying our money is backed by the labor of black people. Look, they're on our money. So you can be assured that our money is worth something because it's backed by slave labor. They were recruited to build bridges, canals, like the Erie Canal here in Fort Wayne, and then railroads. And that's where the large Irish community here came from. Many of them were brought as indentured servants. That means you, in return for passage, you sign your life away for 7 years. You sign yourself into slavery, basically, for 7 years. Well, of course, illiterate peasants doing this, it got doubled to 14, 20, the system was rigged against them. So important that when they passed the 13th Amendment to the Constitution outlawing slavery, it also outlaws indentured servitude. The Irish made sure we included that in there. They faced relentless discrimination. They weren't welcomed with open arms. In fact, the Klan was active against them because of being predominantly Catholic. These signs were everywhere. So they hit the ground running in the United States. They're the only immigrant group to come here already speaking the language. Not because they wanted to, because they were forced to give up their native language in Ireland. So they organized labor unions. They were active in the Democratic Party. And after 80 years, Irish wages reached parity with Anglo wages because of their activism. But And here's the crucial thing. They had to prove their whiteness, that they weren't black, and they did so by discriminating against blacks. And I highly recommend this book by Noah Nadia, How the Irish Became White. Slavery goes away. Where are the slaves going to go after slavery? Good news is you're free. I don't want to minimize that. The bad news is you got nothing. Nothing. No property, no job, no land, no nothing. Where are you going to go? Well, they also made sure, Southern farm owners made sure that you weren't going anywhere because they passed laws to keep you from going places. So in 1900, here's the African American concentration by county in the United States, and you see African Americans are still in the South, 35 years after the Civil War. So anyway, you see where sharecropping was. This is percentage of farms by county. Sharecrop, the orange, darkest orange, is that. So, legal oppression, black codes, and this is where the prison pipeline started with convict leasing. They passed vagrancy laws that any white person had a duty, any white citizen had the duty to challenge any African American to prove that they owned land or were gainfully employed. If they weren't, they could make a citizen's arrest, take them to jail. South Africa based its apartheid system on Mississippi. They just followed us. They said, hey, that's a good system. That's what we'll use. That's where apartheid came from. We invented it. So what you have, and again, this is well documented, in the spring when it was planting time, suddenly all these black vagrants were found and jailed. But hey, we're progressive people. We won't let them rot in jail. They were leased out for $1 to local plantation owners to do the planting. And guess what happens in the fall again? All of a sudden, a lot of black vagrants. Reconstruction collapsed in 1877. You get the Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow was a minstrel stereotype. It was actually played by a white guy. And so we have all the familiar Plessy versus Ferguson and Separate but Equal. We have the whole terror of the Klan, lynching, murder. Again, I highly recommend you look at the documentary 13th by Anna DuVernay. If you haven't seen it, it's pretty amazing. Documenting the convict work system. You want to talk generational wealth gap? Congress created the Freedmen's Savings Bank after the Civil War. Said we're going to help black people get bank accounts. So here was the system. Of course, we're going to have black people manage it. White people manage it. And they mismanaged it, of course, in 1862. He was hoping it would help undermine Southern planters because the goal was to accelerate the development of the Western Territory. Now, we're not even going to talk about Native Americans. That's a conversation for another day. But the idea that we could settle the Western Territory that was filled with natives is pretty outrageous. Granted, adult heads of families, 160 acres. All you had to do is pay a $10 filing fee, live on the land for 5 years, and improve it. Of course, you had to have the $10, right? You had to have the ability to do it. You also had to be a U.S. citizen or in the process of becoming a U.S. citizen, and you couldn't have borne arms against the United States. So that ruled out raging Confederates. 1.5 million white families homesteaded through this act. African Americans leave the South in huge numbers, such that 50% are outside the South, but overwhelmingly, even in the South, an urban people. Very few rural African Americans in the United States today. So what did they face, especially in the North? Relegation to service jobs, recruited as scabs, low-level factory work, excluded from skilled trades systematically, last hired, first fired, housing discrimination. You know how important housing is. I highly recommend this book by a sociologist, Sundown Towns. He started investigating. There are tens of thousands of cities and towns in the United States today that still have on their books whites only after sundown. Now, enforcing this legally could be problematic, but just knowing that there's a law on the books that black people can't be here after sundown. Violence and terror. We had the so-called race riots in World War I and World War II, which were really pogroms. For instance, in Cincinnati, 1917, they just burnt the whole black neighborhood to the ground. Said, there's no place for you to live. You can leave now, thank you. We're done with you. And that was happening everywhere. James Weldon Johnson, African-American poet, called it the Red Summer. 1919 was so vicious. Red because of the blood that flowed, African-American blood. And of course, Tulsa in 1921, which has had a bit of a revival in people's consciousness. Greenwood, so-called Black Wall Street, completely destroyed. 10,000 black people made homeless and all their wealth destroyed. That's intergenerational loss. This is risky. We're not going to lend, or we're going to lend at much higher rates in African American neighborhoods. It's interesting to understand that redlining still goes on today. This is from 2004 to 2008. Provide access to the suburbs, easy car access, suburbs that weren't afraid to say, we're all white people here. We don't let black people in. The FHA, which made it possible after World War II for white people to buy homes that they never would have been able to afford because you only need 10% down, and long-term mortgage is guaranteed by the government. And the VA did as well. Factories, offices, shopping built in the suburbs, right? Where African Americans, where the buses don't run, and they don't want you there anyway. Use of the legal system, laws, annexation, incorporation, home rule. Suburbs are able to wall themselves off using building codes and other devices when they couldn't use blatantly racist stuff. And then racial covenants, which existed for a long time, that you had to agree as a white homeowner not to sell your house to blacks. If I had to sum it up, I would say, at every level, prioritize diversity and equity. At the individual level, I'm incredibly inspired by Helen Keller, somebody who, she caught a fever and became completely blind and deaf at the age of 2. Her story told a miracle worker. She went on, got 2 college degrees, wrote 5 books, and gave speeches all over the world, even though she could never hear the sound of her own voice. She says, I'm only one, but still I am one. I cannot do everything, but still I can do that thing that I can do. I will not refuse to do it. So, educate yourself. Listen to the stories of those who are really experiencing oppression. Check your stereotypes and biases. Incorporate diversity in your life. It's so interesting to me that white people have the ability to get enough money to move to exclusive neighborhoods where they can live with white people. They can raise kids who only go to school and associate with other white people. They can even have jobs where they don't associate. And recognize your own privilege. Recognize that as white people, the thing has been rigged in our favor the whole time. Now, I got into graduate school. I never questioned it. I assumed I got into graduate school on my own merits. They accepted me because I was a worthy candidate. And I hope that's true. But you know what? I don't know for sure. Did I get that slot because an even more competent, or at least equally competent, African American didn't have the resources to apply because of intergenerational wealth? I've never had to question it. I get to walk through the world as a white person just assuming that everything I do is on my merit. Not realizing that I'm walking on the moving sidewalk that's carrying me along. I didn't ask to be on this moving sidewalk, but here I am. And I feel real good about myself. So we need to understand that this is a key thing for white people. You can't write yourself a pass. People want to do this all the time. Say, well, I'm not a racist. I've got a black friend. You know, or whatever. I do something or other. I'm not a racist. You can't write yourself a hall pass, right? It doesn't work that way. You have to look at impact versus intention. Yet all these people say, I'm sorry if you were offended. I'm not racist. I know I said that, but I'm sorry if you were offended. Like it's your problem. No, we have to put aside intentions. Just because I don't intend to discriminate against you doesn't mean you're not discriminating against. If we leave here today and you walk out in that parking lot and I run over you with my car and then I say to you, but I didn't mean to, that's all good, right? I'm sure that one of these injury law firms will say, your lawyer will tell you, but he apologized. It's all good. We don't have a case. He apologized. I don't think so. It's the impact that matters. Because people that are oppressed cannot erase that experience. Yes? I just have to say something about equity. If you see something, say something. But it can always be done in a respectful way, even to haters. No, I don't think you ever win anyone over by saying you're such an idiot, or I just think you're a racist, or you're stupid. Only stupid people say that, or whatever. It's always better to say, I'm offended, and educate them and give direct impact on you. I can't speak for all, but I can speak for myself. So we say, white people, you can't use the N-word. We don't use it in our house. I can't stop all white people from using the N-word, but nobody uses it in my house. All my kids' friends that came over say, you can't use the N-word here. And I say, I'll explain it to you if you want, but as long as you follow the rules. All right, so finally, I want to talk about just show you this graphic on equality versus equity. Too often we mistake equality for equity. We say, well, everybody has equal opportunity to have a stool to watch the game, have a box to watch the game. But that's really the equal opportunity to be unequal. Equity is when people get what they need, right? The tall kid doesn't need a stool. So that's unfair. He doesn't have a box. He doesn't need a box. So equity is this.